Welcome to From Skills to Modes, Standard 1 Interpretive Communication. My name is Candace Black, and I am your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages at the New York State Education Department. In this workshop, the presenter, Dr. Joanne O'Toole, will help you get to know this first standard, which is an input-focused standard designed to scaffold learners' target language comprehension. In this session, you will take a deep dive into interpretive communication and its elements, as well as the resources developed to support you in its implementation. You will see examples of the interpretive mode applied to various text types at checkpoints A, B, and C, and you will come away with a set of strategies for scaffolding your learners' interpretive communication. Our workshop presenter today is Dr. Joanne O'Toole, a professor of modern language education in the Curriculum and Instruction Department at SUNY Oswego. Dr. O'Toole is a member of the Executive Committee of the NYSED World Languages Content Advisory Panel and the Principal Investigator of the New York State World Languages Standards Initiative. She has served in several world language leadership positions, including NYSAFLT President and NECTFL Director, and is a regular presenter at national, regional, state, and local conferences. Joanne is a certified teacher of Spanish and taught Spanish for 16 years prior to entering post-secondary education. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. O'Toole to begin this workshop.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New York State Education Department, Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages, Professional Learning Series associated with the World Language Standards Initiative. Today's session is entitled From Skills to Modes, Standard 1, Interpretive Communication. And again, I'm Joanne O'Toole. We'll use 4 symbols to guide some of our actions in tonight's session. First, the muted microphone to remind you to keep your microphone muted. A blue thought bubble letting you know that this is a time to think alone about either ideas or questions that are on the screen. The green chat box invites you to enter comments and questions into the chat. And the yellow folder icon lets you know that the contents that are on the screen will also be in a folder that will be shared with you and associated with this session. This is the first in a series entitled From Skills to Modes. Today's session is on Standard 1 Interpretive Communication. 2 weeks from today is Standard 2 Interpersonal Communication with Bill Heller. And 2 weeks after that, April 7th, also 4 to 5 p.m., Standard 3 Presentational Communication presented by Lori Langer de Ramirez. There will be CTLE credits available for all sessions, and all sessions will also be recorded so that you can view them on demand. So mark your calendars and register for all of the sessions. There are 4 goals for today's session, starting with I can define and differentiate language skills and communicative modes. Next, I can identify reasons for the standard shift from language skills to communicative modes. Third, I can interpret what is meant by the wording of Standard 1, Interpretive Communication. And finally, I can identify ways to meaningfully apply Standard 1. So, based on what you already know, I invite you to think about the following 4 questions. What are language skills? What are modes of communication? How do modes differ from language skills? And how do modes relate to language skills? So be thinking about these 4 questions over the next several slides, and then I'll be bringing the questions back to ask you to think about how your thinking has been confirmed, how it's been revised, how it's been enhanced. We'll start by defining language skills. I suspect these are very familiar ideas. Reading, writing, speaking, listening, and signing. So New York State Education Department has provided us guidance over time. In 1986, Modern Languages for Communication and Latin for Communication defined the checkpoint proficiencies, A, B, and C, by language skill. New York State Standards for Languages Other than English in 1996 paired those language skills in their key ideas, reading and writing, speaking and listening. And now in 2021, our revised New York State World Language Learning Standards will be shifting us to communicative modes. So what's our rationale for this shift from skills to modes? Here's a quote from the World Readiness Standards, which are the national standards that inspired the new New York State standards. The skills paradigm gives an insufficient description of communicative acts. For example, all listening tasks are not the same in terms of conditions, learning processes, or strategies. Listening to a person face to face and listening to the news on the television are very distinct tasks and require different approaches to teaching, to learning, and to doing. So, in a nutshell, the skills just aren't enough to represent the way the communication takes place naturally. So take a look. Here's a family. They're watching a movie on television. Mom makes a comment, and son responds. And maybe daughter asks a question, and father has something to say. And after the movie, the mom was so impressed, she went to her social media accounts and she let her friends know what a great movie it was. What you see here is interpretive viewing. Interpretive is the mode, viewing is the skill. Interpersonal speaking, interpersonal the mode, and speaking the skill. And presentational writing, presentational being the mode, and writing being the skill. So what defines communicative modes? Well, they place primary emphasis on the context and the purpose of communication. So we just saw the context of viewing a movie. And as you saw, there were multiple purposes of communication, from making meaning from the movie that the family was watching, to expressing opinions and asking questions about the content of what they were viewing, to sharing and making a recommendation to friends about the great movie that was seen. And these 4 skills, or we would say 5 skills by adding in our signing, are working in an integrated fashion. So think about what you just saw in that previous slide. It wasn't that they just viewed, or they just spoke with one another, or that the mom just presented out, but rather all of those communicative acts were integrated and they were drawing on multiple language skills as they did so. So think back to those 4 questions. How have your understandings been confirmed, refined, or changed? What are language skills? What are modes of communication? How do modes differ from language skills? And how do modes relate to language skills? Feel free to just think about this, or feel free to put a new understanding that you may have into the chat. Or if you have a question, feel free to enter that as well. So take a moment to think about language skills, language modes, how they differ, how they relate to one another. Bill or Lori, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, one just popped up. We have, for clarification, is mode the use of the skills to achieve a goal in the context?
That would be a lovely way of putting it. Yes. Anything
Great.
else?
We have someone who is saying when she thinks of skills, she thinks more of proficiency.
And that's an interesting point because the ACTFL proficiency guidelines are identified by skill: speaking, listening, reading, writing. One of the things that's interesting is that proficiency was defined and described before the modes of communication were introduced. But yet, as you can see from that slide about the family viewing the television, it wasn't that they weren't engaging with the skills, it's just that they were using them within a particular context. So it's that relationship between skills and modes is that the modes incorporate multiple skills based on the context. Anything else?
Several folks have talked about the importance of context and understanding, the modes in terms of the context in which the skills are used, and they're kind of bringing that idea home, reinforcing that idea that you brought out.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move ahead. And I want to point out to you that what you have in front of you is a screenshot of the first 3 standards of the revised New York State standards for world languages. And you'll see that little folder icon that says that you're going to have access to these standards in that folder at the end of this session. Just so you know, next Monday, March 15th, is when we're anticipating that the Board of Regents will be approving our new standards. So there are 3 communication standards that have an overarching anchor standard of communication. The 3 numbered standards are: number 1, interpretive communication; number 2, interpersonal communication; number 3, presentational communication. And our focus today is on interpretive communication. We're going to give it a closer look in some future slides. The 3 numbered communication standards are accompanied by 1 overarching anchor standard for cultures and 2 numbered culture standards: Standard 4, relating cultural practices and products to perspectives, and Standard 5, cultural comparisons. Again, you'll have access to all the standards in the folder after this session. So, why is interpretive communication standard number 1? I want you to start by looking at this wonderful icon that we were given permission to use by the Cobb County World Language Department. Notice how there are 3 arrows that are pointing inward toward the individual. Well, interpretive communication is standard 1 because it represents input. And we know that input is the starting place for language acquisition. It's the starting place for meaning making. It supports content and culture learning. It provides a purpose for output. And that output is in the other modes of communication that you'll learn more about in the upcoming 2 sessions that we have. So here's the specific wording of the interpretive communication standard. Learners understand, interpret, and analyze what is heard, read, received, or viewed on a variety of topics using a range of diverse texts, including authentic resources. So what we're going to do next is we're going to unpack all of those words. What do they mean? What do they tell us? How do they inform our work in applying the interpretive mode, the interpretive communication standard? So the first words, learners understand, interpret, and analyze, represent 3 scaffolded language functions. And scaffolded refers to a set of tiers. Language functions, to be clear, that make sure we all have a shared definition, are the purposes for which we have our students use language. And so here are our tiers, and notice that understand is at the bottom, above that interpret, and at the top analyze. When we talk about understand, we're talking about having students understand what is right there in front of them. It's literal, it's visible, there's nothing that they can't see. Interpret is at that inferential level. It's when we're having students read between the lines, and they have to have understood before they can interpret. And at the top, we have analyze, which is going beyond the text. So we're using what we've learned from the text and we're bringing in that outside sort of information. So you can see that there's really quite a bit of intentionality in how the language functions of the interpretive mode are designed to represent different levels of comprehension. And because we don't want to be putting the word understand in learning objectives or can-do statements, because how do we measure understand? It's kind of a vague sort of word. I want to point out to you that there are many ideas that represent understanding, many different ways to express the language function of understand. So we might say students will be able to recognize cognates, identify facts, sequence information, identify topic and subtopic, identify main idea and details. Other ways of expressing interpret might be make inferences, predict, draw conclusions, guess meaning from context, make cross-cultural comparisons. And some alternatives to analyze include identify the author's perspective, identify cultural perspectives, compare cultural perspectives, and express personal reactions. The second element of the interpretive mode is of the interpretive standard, is what is heard, read, received, or viewed. So here is where the language skills are embedded into the standard. And notice that the language skills that are part of the interpretive mode standard are all those that are input focused. So what is heard? You can see we have someone who's listening. What is read? We have someone who's reading. What is received? Here's someone who's interpreting what has been signed. And what is viewed refers to multimedia on a variety of topics. So this is where the standard is referring to contextualization. And where do we get those topics? Well, along with the new New York State standards, we also have themes and topics. You'll see 4 columns representing 4 themes: identity and social relationships, contemporary life, science, technology, and the arts, global awareness, and community engagement. And under each one of these themes is a set of topics. Some of them should look pretty familiar, like the ones that were in the Modern Languages for Communication guidance from 1986. Some are new. They are not intended to be 17 different units of instruction, or as you can see, some of these are specifically checkpoint C, checkpoint B, so maybe checkpoint A 14. No. Let's take a look. The topics then, as in 1986 to present, we had 15 discrete topics with subtopics that were planned and taught as 15 discrete units of instruction in a lot of classrooms, not all classrooms. And so where are we going now with this? Now we have those 4 overarching themes. each with associated topics, but they're intended to be integrated to create meaningful and interdisciplinary thematic units. And a little bit later on, you're going to have the opportunity to see what this looks like at 3 different checkpoints. And the last element of the interpretive standard states using a range of diverse texts, including authentic resources. And authentic resources are sources of cultural input. You may have other sorts of texts that are simply sources of input. Authres, those of you who are on social media, you've probably seen that hashtag, and that's one of those heads up on places where people are sharing out authentic resources. And to define authentic resources, you're going to see that they are unedited and they're unsimplified texts that may be in print, audio, or visual format, or some combination of those. For example, some print authentic resources may be in infographic, article, poem sorts of formats, and many, many more. Audio, podcasts, songs. Visual, signed content, commercials, images, artwork. The possibilities are endless. And authentic resources are created by and for members of the target culture for real-world purposes other than language learning. You may have noticed the folder icon at the top of the page. That icon is there because there is a document that will walk you through not only what authentic resources are, why they matter, why they're part of our standards, but also how to choose them and where to find them. So you'll want to look for that document when you get to the folder. So I ask you to think about your understandings of Standard 1 Interpretive Communication. How have your understandings been confirmed, refined, changed? Take a moment to think about that, and then feel free to add your questions and comments into the chat. And Bill and Lori, I ask you to monitor the chat and let me know what people are saying.
Sure will. Any observations folks have? Confirmed what they already knew.
Love that.
Megan has a comment about this as language. We've also used it. It is not really an authentic resource because it is something that is designed specifically for teaching, but there is some good language there.
And so I just really want to, even though my slide focused on authentic resources, we were very intentional in putting in those words using a range of diverse texts. Our standard is not written in a way to say that the only kind of text is the authentic text. But I would point out something that Bill Heller discovered. Actually, Bill, could I ask you to talk about the regateo?
Sure. One of the, I was researching a lesson idea for surrounding the custom of bargaining for prices in the marketplace, connected to a thematic unit on artesania. And I was going to throw in a task where I had the kids role play a traditional market regateo as I had participated in Mexico 20, 30 years ago. When I started to research the authentic res for regateo and so forth, lo and behold, I find that the culture is changing and the idea of the regateo is considered exploitative and not valuing the artisanship of the craftspersons, and exploitative of indigenous populations that are engaged in these traditional crafts. So I found out that by using the authentic resources, I had a current cultural mirror on what was going on and wasn't perpetuating an old stereotype. You want to find, you'll find, if you want more information about authentic resources, we already have on the State Ed website the 2 presentations from Leslie Grahn, and you might want to refer to those, and they'll give you some great practical tips and ideas on using authentic resources in depth, more depth than we can cover today.
Thank you, Bill. And the reason that I asked him to share that experience with you is because, you know, we have textbooks that, you know, many of us are required to use, but it may well be that the cultural content that they include is outdated or not representative of current practices. And so that is one of the gifts of the authentic resources. So another approach is partnering, where I'm using a text that I maybe need to use because it's in my textbook, or where it's what I'm familiar with, or it's the adopted novel. But then I'm pulling in addition, the authentic resources that allow me to compare and contrast then and now, that allow me to see what's current, that allow me to add perspective. Are there any other comments or questions regarding Standard 1?
Most of
Joanne,
them.
oh, go ahead, Bill.
Most of them are just reinforcing. You're saying you're reinforcing ideas that they already had and maybe giving them a little extra nuance and some more examples to work from.
Perfect. Thank you. Lori?
Yeah, one quick question about understanding, interpreting, and analyzing. The question is, should these skills be scaffolded over the course of the unit plan or achieved in a single lesson?
So I think both can be true. One of the things that I'll be showing you shortly is the notion of when you have students engage in interpretive communication, it's not that you have them look at that resource once and it's a one and done, but rather it's something that you might have them engage with multiple times and multiple purposes. Not squandering the resource and working with it in layers. And those layers might be working from understanding those key facts to then using what we learned about those key facts and partnering it with what we know beyond the text. So my sense would be that the ideal is to use multiple levels of comprehension with a given text, a given authentic resource. And whether that takes place in a given day or whether that takes place over multiple days would be up to you, and it would be up to the level of the student, the time you had to dedicate to it. Anything else?
Maybe one more. Ivania had a wonderful idea about allowing students to find authentic resources from their own cultural background, which is a great way of differentiating if you have heritage language or home language speakers. And I think that's a wonderful suggestion. I'm glad you shared that.
Absolutely. The sensitivity that we need to have relative to the students we're teaching. You know, sometimes we think about, well, what are our students interested in? But when it comes to heritage, it's their identity, and we need to bring those identities into the classroom. Thank you so much for that. All right. So here's where we're going to be putting those ideas together. So the first step in putting all of this together, in getting ready to use the interpretive standard, is to select the thematic focus. We already know that we have a list of themes and topics, but we want to remember, put those together to create interdisciplinary units. So I'm going to be showing you 3 examples. This first one is at checkpoint A. And I began with the theme of contemporary life, and I chose the anchor topic of school life and education. And then I thought about the elements of this unit. Well, at checkpoint A, things that are really familiar to the students are what's best. So what's needed for school? School shopping for supplies, school shopping for clothing. How do they get to school? Well, where's their school located? What's the transportation that's available given the geography? What takes place in school? Subjects that they study, thinking about the schedules, lunch, what are the foods that are served, what are the extracurricular activities that are available in terms of clubs and sports and music. And of course, even though all of these things are things they can talk about relative to themselves, they're also things that they can talk about relative to a target culture. Every one of these points is hyperlinked, the bulleted points is hyperlinked to an authentic resource. And in each case, I hyperlink them to a resource from Spain. One of the things I do worry about sometimes when we bounce from culture to culture is that, or country to country, is that we might end up confusing our students or causing them to think that something that they read about from Uruguay is true of Spain because they speak Spanish there. So that's one of those decisions you want to be thoughtful about, intentional about. Where are you drawing your authentic resources from so that you're representing the cultures well, that you're not creating stereotypes and overgeneralizations. But looking at the theme, looking at kind of the sub-themes, looking at the topics within them, what you'll find is that my Checkpoint A unit, Going to School, incorporates the topics of school life and education, shopping, communities and neighborhood, travel, physical environment, climate, weather, geography, food and meal taking, and leisure. So this wasn't a unit on a single topic. This was a meaningful unit, real world, that brought together multiple topics in an integrated way. Here's an example at Checkpoint B. Theme, global awareness and community engagement. The anchor topic, environmental issues and sustainability. 3 kind of sub-topics of the element: the environment around us, the need for environmental protections, protecting and respecting the environment. So in looking at the environment around us, I might have students look at natural elements, look at geography, and consider the identity of people who live in particular geographic settings. Looking at human-made issues, natural disasters, and events that would promote the need for environmental protections. Creating awareness, recycling, ecotourism, and personal commitments, all related to the idea of protecting and respecting the environment. Again, an interdisciplinary unit that I've entitled Protecting Our World, that incorporates the topics of environmental issues and sustainability, physical environment, climate, weather, and geography, communities and neighborhood, identity, shopping, health and wellness, technology, media and social media, and travel. And you'll see if you click on those links, and you will get a copy of the PowerPoint in that folder after this session, that all of the authentic resources relate to these different topics. I would say that as you're planning these kinds of units, you may really gather quite a few authentic resources, and then in a given year with given groups of students, decide to use certain ones, not use others. But you have them and they're available to you. You just want to make sure that if you use them in a future year, they're up to date, and of course that your links are functional if there were things you didn't download. And here's a third one at Checkpoint C. Contemporary life was the theme that I chose, and food and meal taking as the anchor topic. I divided the unit into 3 parts: food at home and in the community, food in society, global and economic impacts of food. And again, you can see all the topics that I've organized, and we'll see over here that I've brought in multiple topics to work in an integrated sort of fashion. So now we have a thematic focus. What's our next step? Well, we need to consult the performance indicators. So another tool that's been created for you to accompany the standards, to accompany the themes and topics, are the performance indicators. You'll see on the screenshot that this says Category 1-2, Modern Languages. There's a separate set of performance indicators for Category 3-4, Modern Languages. And then there's a separate set of performance indicators for classical languages. You'll note that the screenshot I've shown you here is for the Interpretive Communication Standard 1. And there's a page of these for each standard and each checkpoint. And then you'll notice that our checkpoints are being defined by ranges. So checkpoint A has the novice mid to novice high proficiency ranges. Again, Category 1-2 Modern Languages. Checkpoint B, intermediate low to intermediate mid proficiency ranges. Checkpoint C, intermediate mid to intermediate high. And intermediate high, again, for Category 1-2 Modern Languages, aligns with the target for the seal of biliteracy. Intermediate mid takes a long time to achieve, so we see it covering across 2 checkpoints. And so this is a place where you can go in thinking about, who am I planning for? And say I'm planning for my checkpoint A students who are looking towards novice high. When I read the descriptor, I can see the language function. So for example, identify the topic right there. That's my understand. And some isolated facts. So it really talks about that literal nature of what we can expect that our novice high student level students can do, checkpoint A students can do on their own. In what contexts? Well, from informational and literary texts. And what text type? Simple sentences. So this is what we expect them to be able to do on their own, as we have prepared them, as we've designed our instruction to prepare them to do it. So we want to make sure that we're designing our instruction, our tasks for students that are at levels appropriate for the checkpoint. Does it mean we can't go to the next level up? Absolutely not. Let's go ahead and put in those scaffolds, those sentence starters, close passages, other scaffolds that allow students to perform beyond where they currently are. So we have our thematic focus, we've consulted our performance indicators. Now we write our I can statements. I can statements really are our goal statements, and they can be written at the unit level a little bit more vaguely and written at the lesson level with much more specificity. So thinking back to the Interpretive Communication Standard, remember that we saw understand, interpret, and analyze language functions, heard, read, received, or viewed language skills, variety of topics, our context, and then of course our authentic resources, and of course other texts, where the authentic resources being where our cultural knowledge is housed. And so we use those ideas to have a template for our I can statements. I can perform a particular language function in a particular context using a particular skill, and if I'm using authentic resources, I'm embedding cultural knowledge. So let's see what that looks like. Remember those 3 thematic unit plan brainstorms that I shared with you. Here's an I can statement that might accompany the checkpoint A example. I can identify essential school supplies described in a Spanish newspaper. So identify is the language function. Essential school supplies is the context. And because it's been described in a newspaper, we know our students are going to be reading. It doesn't say reading, but it's implied. And it's cultural knowledge because this is an authentic Spanish newspaper. So the perspectives that are presented are cultural. What's essential? Well, that's cultural. At checkpoint B, I can infer the relationship between Costa Rican geography and identity based on currency images. Again, infer is our language function. The relationship between Costa Rican geography and identity is the context. And the currency images, well, because the students are observing these, viewing these, then this is viewing, and they might be reading some of the text on the currency images, so they might also be reading. And cultural knowledge because the currency is authentic to Costa Rica, so it represents Costa Rican perspectives. And I'm going to apologize to you because I forgot to go back and add my can-do statement for checkpoint C. You'll see it shortly. So putting it all together, we've got a thematic focus, we've got performance indicators, we've consulted the performance indicators, we've written the I-CAN statements, and now we need to design meaningful learning tasks for before, during, and after use with the authentic resource or other text. And I'm just plugging in here that notion of before, during, and after, because as you recall, somebody was asking, what about using those different levels of comprehension? Where am I using them? And a great place to use them is before, during, and after, because that paradigm really deepens what's the meaning that students can make from any text, including an authentic text. So what you have here is that checkpoint A example, the going to school unit. And you can see a screenshot from the article that I got from El País, a newspaper in Spain, entitled School Supplies for the Return to School, 15 Essential Items for Students, or at least that's the English title. And my I CAN statement, I can identify essential school supplies described in a Spanish newspaper article. And I've noted for you again, function, context, skill, and cultural knowledge with my color coding. So before reading this article, I may have students predict which school supplies will be identified as essential in a Spanish back-to-school newspaper article. They're likely pulling on their own knowledge of what school supplies are essential. While they're reading, I would have them identify which school supplies are identified as essential, an opportunity to check the accuracy of their predictions. And then maybe sequence the school supplies by the importance they're given in the article. And after reading, I might have students compare which school supplies are identified as essential in the article with the ones you predicted would be essential, which is in essence a cross-cultural comparison. My checkpoint B example, I can infer the relationship between Costa Rican geography and identity based on currency images. Again, function, context, skill, and cultural knowledge. And over to the left, you can see pictures of 3 different banknotes, the 2,000, 10,000, and 50,000 colones, which is the Costa Rican currency. And before viewing, I might have my students identify features of Costa Rican geography just by viewing a map. They'll notice the water, they'll notice the land, they'll notice the topography. And then exchange ideas with a partner about how these geographic features might influence the Costa Rican life and identity. And notice exchanging ideas with a partner that would have students engaged in interpersonal communication. So I want to make clear that we don't do interpretive communication in isolation. The last example I gave you was strictly interpretive communication, but absolutely we can integrate the modes. And then while viewing the banknotes, have students identify the geographic images in the colones, one denomination at a time. And then after viewing, perhaps hypothesize why Costa Rica would choose to put these images on their currency. And then infer the relationship between Costa Rican geography and identity. Because the money of a country is one element of its identity. And the checkpoint C theme, here's the I can statement I forgot to show you. One second. I can identify cultural perspectives associated with traditional Mexican.
Joanne, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So identify cultural perspectives associated with traditional Mexican cooking expressed in a cooking video. And if you have not seen this little abuelita, you want to make sure you do. She has a YouTube channel and she shows you how she does her traditional Mexican cooking. So before listening and viewing, students might brainstorm what is meant by traditional cooking. Again, they might be doing this interpersonally. List reasons to value traditional cooking on the left side of a Venn diagram. This is additionally presentational communication as well as ultimately interpretive communication. While viewing and listening, maybe that first viewing, they're identifying characteristics of Mexican traditional cooking. On the second and maybe the third viewing, list the value given to Mexican traditional cooking on the right side of a Venn diagram. And after viewing and listening, really engage in comparing and contrasting cultural perspectives on traditional cooking. So again, before, during, after, at multiple levels of interpretive communication. So at this point, I invite you to go back to the goals from today's session. I can define and differentiate language skills and communicative modes. I can identify reasons for the standard shifts from language skills to communicative modes. I can interpret what is meant by the wording of Standard 1, interpretive communication, and I can identify ways to meaningfully apply Standard 1. And after you've had a moment to think about that, I invite you to put your questions and comments in the chat. And Lori and Bill, I ask you to please monitor the chat and let me know what people are saying.
Sure will. Question, are there specific verbs that are associated with the interpretive mode?
So if you think back to the slide where I showed you understand, interpret, and analyze, those language functions are the language functions that you will want to draw on at those different levels. So not necessarily specific verbs as much as specific ways of thinking about the text, moving from what's right in front of me at the understand level to my reading between the lines at the interpret level and my moving beyond the text at the analyze level.
Joanne, there's a comment that folks would love to see how this works in a scope and sequence of an entire year. So thinking kind of on the macro level, how many units? How do we choose structures to emphasize within these units? Do you have any Any advice you can give with regard to that kind of macro frame?
Okay, well, the first thing I want to say is that this is the beginning of a very lengthy professional learning set of opportunities. And so today's goals were really to just dig deep into the interpretive mode. And then of course we'll be digging deep into, and actually I'll just go to that next slide, into the interpersonal, the presentational mode. Then we're going to be talking about integrating the modes. We'll get deep into the culture standards. We're going to be looking at what does it look like to design a unit that draws on the modes of communication and uses the performance indicators and uses the themes and topics. And we'll be talking about curriculum design. So that question really takes us beyond what we can talk about today and what the goals of today's session are. But I promise you, we will have those opportunities and resources available to you in time. And then in terms of, okay, so where is the grammar? Where is the vocabulary? The grammar and vocabulary, again, those are going to be sessions later on. But in a nutshell, they're in support of the language function. So if we're asking students to predict, then maybe we're working in the future tense. If we're asking students to talk about the environment, or for example, what they see on the Costa Rican banknotes, we want to make sure that they have the vocabulary related to talking about the different biomes and the different geographic features. So our language functions and our contexts are going to guide our decisions around the vocabulary and the grammar.
Joanne, could you comment just briefly on the phase-in, how when we'll start using these and so forth? Assuming they're adopted, what school year will they be in effect?
Absolutely. So again, they will be presented to the Board of Regents on Monday, March 15th. If the Board of Regents gives the go-ahead, which we're anticipating that they will, then any district that wants to be an early adopter can go ahead and begin integrating the new standards into their curriculum planning. We recommend that you start small. You might work as a district or at a given level of instruction to design a set of lessons, to design a unit, things like that. But the standards won't be required to be applied until September of 2023, and only starting with the first level of checkpoint A. If that is 7th grade at the secondary level, if it's not 7th grade, if your program begins at 8th grade, then that would be 2024, September 2024. If you have an elementary school program, whatever grade level you begin that at, fall of 2023 is the required time to begin using the new standards. So you can see that you have quite a bit of time, and you'll have a lot of support as you move through your readiness to apply them.
A really interesting question. What do you think the main difference is between the new New York State standards and the NECTFL national standards?
So one of the things you'll notice about the new New York State standards is that there are 5 of them, and of the numbered standards. And the NECTFL standards, there are 11. The standards review committees they painstakingly made decisions about whether to adopt all 11 standards or whether to integrate them in some way. And so what you'll see is that the communication standards, 2 of them, standard 4 is 2 of the NECTFL culture standards together as one, and standard 5 is one of the comparison standards. The connections area is really embedded in the themes and topics, and the community standard is really embedded in the way that our communication standards are worded. So we are coming upon the very end of this session. Is there one more burning question?
Just a lot of affirmation that people are excited about this. They think these changes are overdue and are they're ready to go, which is great to hear.
And we really want to thank everyone. We had over 200 teachers from across the state who participated in the development of these standards. And when we put out a public comment period to get your feedback, we had almost 1,200 comments. There will be one more comment period coming, which is, do you approve the name change or agree with the name change from LOT to World Languages? And so when you get that email, would you please accept the email, go to the link, and let us know that you agree with the movement to World Languages? And hopefully you do.
Maybe one more if you have just another second
I
before
have a
wrapping up.
moment.
A good question about the relationship between the New York identified themes and topics and AP. What relationship is there between those?
So when we began the work, again, this was the work of the Standards Committee, hundreds of teachers. We looked at AP themes, we looked at IB themes, and we looked at our topics that previously existed. And when we did that, we decided on what you have in front of you. It was what would best support teachers in New York State, a bit of our heritage and a bit of moving out and connecting to what already exists for IB and AP. So there's definitely similarities, but they're not identical. So at this point, I would ask Candy, can you put in the link, if you haven't already done so, and maybe you have, a link to the folder?
I will do that right now, Joanne.
Okay, and then after this session, I will be putting a PDF of my slides in the folder. The PDF of the slides is not in there yet. And you are welcome to contact me if you have questions. I didn't put my email address out there, but it's my first name dot last name, Joanne.O'Toole at oswego.edu. Or you can always contact Candy Black through State Ed, and she can be in touch with me. We look forward to seeing you at the next session on March 24th. Thank you so very, very much for being here today.